Thank you for joining. I hope you can see my screen. We want to make this an interactive session, so please feel free to use the GoToWebinars chat functionality to go in and pose any questions that we will make sure to address towards the end of the broadcast. So really quickly, we also have a guest speaker with us, Alex Yon. He is the Chief Technology Officer at Wagepoint. Wagepoint is a leading provider of payroll and financial services, headquartered in Canada and also delivering services here in the United States. And he will share his perspective on how they went through a SOC audit. So we have a lot of interesting content for you, and we'll go ahead and get started momentarily. So let's go ahead and dive in. So today's webinar will consist of primarily two speakers. I'm GT, the CEO and founder of stackArmor, and I'll be talking to you a little bit about vulnerability testing, penetration scanning, specifically on the AWS environment for compliance and audit requirements, for meeting compliance and audit requirements. I've spent almost the last 10 years working on compliance-based solutions on AWS, starting with the first migration of a large web system to AWS way back in 2009, system called recovery.gov for the White House. And since then, we've been working and supporting customers in healthcare, financial services, public sector, as well as startups, go in and meet specific compliance requirements using the AWS cloud service. It gives me great pleasure also to have a co-speaker with me, Alex Yon, as I briefly mentioned. He is the Chief Technology Officer at Wagepoint, and he will be sharing his perspective on how to go through a SOC audit, the sort of interesting nuances of getting that audit done while operating on AWS, and how they made certain business decisions and technical decisions in going through this audit process. So a little bit about stackArmor. We are a full-service Amazon cloud migration, managed services, managed security services, and compliance solution shop. We again have for many, many years worked on AWS-based compliance projects, specifically around NIST, HIPAA, FFIEC, and different kinds of ISO and GDPR standards. Again, our specialization is in bringing three things together: the Amazon cloud, robust security engineering, and then the compliance framework, such that you can then go in and sort of meet the needs of your auditors and customers when you have some specific compliance needs that you must demonstrate. We have a pretty strong relationship with AWS. We are part of the Amazon Partner Network, advanced consulting partner, and we have the distinction of being one of the 10 companies selected globally by AWS for the security competency that was launched last year. So in terms of really the solutions we offer, clearly the IT landscape around us is changing. There are lots of breaches, lots of security concerns, and more generally, a lot more business being conducted digitally online. And so a lot of organizations, countries, governments are starting to take notice of all of the cyber threats and are starting to institute stronger regulatory requirements. And also larger commercial entities are starting to go in and ask more questions around the cybersecurity posture of their vendors and their supply chain. And so it's critical that everybody has not only strong security, but also has the ability to go in and demonstrate that they have strong security, and that really leads to a more complicated compliance environment. And so really stackArmor focuses on providing solutions in that space. I won't go through each one of these, but again, I think I did introduce some of these services. Our goal is to really go and make sure our customers are able to go in and stay secure on the AWS platform, as well as go in and provide compliance services to ensure that posture. So let's go into the meat of this presentation. So when we talk about vulnerability testing and penetration scanning for meeting audit requirements, it's really important to understand the basic principles that go in and drive audit and compliance requirements. And they generally boil down to three things. So we have to be able to go in and demonstrate that the data and the web application that we have hosted, they're able to go in and meet the criteria around three factors: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And depending on the compliance framework, you might see different variations, but we call it the C, I, framework. And really, this is sort of an enduring framework that NIST uses, and it's used by the whole federal government as sort of an initial basic foundation to go in and establish a security and compliance framework. And so really the goal is to go in and make sure from a confidentiality standpoint that your system and your data obviously is protected against unauthorized access. And additionally, you have the ability to detect and respond to unauthorized access. So all of us today from an IT standpoint know that there are a number of threat actors. There are a lot of things sort of that are happening around us. And so while we might go in and implement robust security controls, but we must be able to go in and detect in case something goes wrong. So it's sort of this notion of continuous monitoring. Integrity. And so we need to be able to make sure that we are able to go in and, as a business or as an organization, attest to the quality of the information that's resident in our systems. That means there are means by which that nobody can go in and tamper with the information, change it in some way, shape, or form, or in other ways, essentially go in and change what is considered authoritative sources of information. And then finally, availability, right? So in the context of demonstrating the security impact of availability or lack thereof, think of a DDoS attack. So if you're a critical service, if there are other organizations, your customers that are dependent on you and your service is a critical part of their supply chain, then if there is a DDoS attack which limits the availability of your service, then that is again of concern, and we must make sure that you have the means and the processes in place to detect such an event, respond to it, and that's where all of these concepts of resilience engineering, etc., come up. But basically, your auditors, your customers, and most compliance frameworks are really interested in making sure that your system is able to go in and demonstrate confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so again, having an understanding of these basic principles is really critical to help you sort of get on the journey of compliance and meeting your obligations from a security and audit standpoint. So the next step, we get a lot of these questions from some of our customers that are interested in a vulnerability scan or a penetration scan. And generally the scenario is we'll get a phone call or an email saying, hey, I'm a solutions provider. I'm hosted on AWS, and we have a large deal on the line, or our auditors are asking us to go in and do this penetration test. And so, it's very interesting that people come in with sort of that request. And a lot of times they don't quite understand what that request exactly means, what exactly is being tested. And so if you don't know that you're operating in an environment like AWS, sometimes people can make the wrong decisions, potentially wrong, costly decisions in how to go about conducting a what we call risk-based assessment. And so the bedrock for making the right judgment call on how to conduct the right vulnerability assessment and penetration scan is to understand the shared responsibility model that governs a cloud infrastructure like AWS. And so as you can see on the graphic, the AWS services in the bottom half are already accredited, and Amazon is responsible for those services. And they spend millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to go in and make sure that their area of responsibility is secure, it's certified, and they meet a global certification and security standards. And if you go to the link that we have on the screen, it'll show you exactly what those standards are and what they mean, right? So when we go in and conduct a penetration test for you, a customer that's operating on top of AWS, there's really no need to go in and conduct a test in trying to, let's say, penetrate Amazon's hypervisor. First of all, that's a bad idea. You'll be in breach of your customers based on your terms of service and your customer agreement, and you're unlikely to go very far and probably get shut down very quickly. So you want to make sure that the shared responsibility model is understood. So really the area of concern and focus that we would have is limited to the areas that you are configuring and deploying your application and data in. And so typically it would mean being able to use identity and access solutions, being able to go in and make sure that your web servers, as an example, are deployed properly, your data is encrypted, your operating systems are fully patched, things of that nature. So again, we want to make sure that we're able to go in and precisely define the area of responsibility, and that leads really to then creating the right vulnerability and penetration test scan. And so this next slide here shows you a little bit of a snapshot. It's a partial snapshot. It's Amazon has a lot of services and they have a number of compliance frameworks. But for example, if you're going in and implementing a SOC compliant environment or a HIPAA compliant environment or a FedRAMP compliant environment, it's absolutely critical that you go in and visit this dashboard so that you can make sure that the services that you're consuming from AWS, they're attested and accredited to the compliance framework that you're interested in, right? And so, for example, if you're going through a SOC audit, you want to make sure that you visit this dashboard and make sure that within your environment, you're only using those services that Amazon says are accredited from a SOC 2 perspective or SOC 1 or SOC 3 standpoint. And so that then ensures that you are then able to go in and piggyback off of Amazon's accreditations, and you're able to go in and provide an assertion to your customers and your auditors that, hey, the underlying infrastructure and services that we're using are already SOC accredited in this case, and so therefore you are able to reduce your burden of having to demonstrate proof. And so this again sort of is a gradual build-up, as I mentioned, on the area of focus and responsibility that you have as the organization going in and configuring and hosting on top of AWS. So from a business standpoint, as you're a service provider that is interested in delivering solutions, business solutions to your customers, now you're going through a compliance process, be it a SOC 2 audit, SOC 1 audit, SOC 3 audit, HIPAA, FedRAMP or NIST CSF, you need to go in and make sure that as you're going through the audit process, really understand what your customers want. And so your customers and your auditors essentially are looking for what we call evidentiary information on the ability of your system to go in and meet the confidentiality, integrity, and availability principles that we talked about earlier. And so one of the ways you can go in and provide that independent third-party evidence is through a vulnerability and penetration testing engagement, where at least the technical aspects of your architecture and of your system can be tested, and then a report can be prepared on the findings from a certified provider like stackArmor that we do for some of our customers. So really the goal is to go in and provide a third-party review of the security posture, and then it's really important for you as the organization that's going through the audit to really quickly understand the ask, right? So there's a lot of confusion in industry and among auditors and quite honestly customers as well on what exactly is a penetration test, what exactly is being asked for, and that'll go in and satisfy this requirement of basically providing the evidentiary information. And so again, the reason for giving you all of this background information on AWS, their compliance posture, and also the shared responsibility model is to help you understand what exactly is it that you're responsible for, and what exactly is the kind of information that you can go in and provide, which will meet the needs and the concerns of the different auditors and your customers that are asking you to go through an audit. So when we talk about a vulnerability assessment and penetration testing engagement on AWS, there are certain rules of the road that must be respected. So as all of you probably have signed a terms of service and a customer agreement, you are bound by those conditions. And so therefore, it's absolutely important that you do not engage or execute any hostile, any activity that could be deemed as hostile by the Amazon engineering and monitoring teams, which could then take the extreme action of shutting you down. So you want to make sure that whatever engagement you execute is within the constraints of your terms and service and agreement. And one of the things that AWS does is they absolutely understand that people have to go through this process, and so they have done a great job in creating a robust process to help you conduct this kind of a scan. And so obviously you want to make sure you do it the right way. And what we highly recommend is to follow what we call a risk-based approach. And I'll share with you a little bit of what that means. And so again, this is the part where I talked about earlier. A lot of times auditors and customers, or your customers, may not be quite sure on what they are asking for. And so again, knowing where the vulnerabilities are and what the most common sources of security issues might be is important, particularly as you're running in an Amazon environment, and so AWS cloud environment. And so again, these are some critical considerations that are important for us to look at as we begin our journey of going through this process for our workload and applications hosted in AWS. So let's look at what we call very common vulnerability hotspots that we see every day when we go in and engage with customers doing vulnerability assessments and penetration scans. So operating in a cloud platform is very different from operating in a colo facility or some kind of a non-cloud environment, because the cloud by definition is a fully managed infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. And so the vulnerabilities are more around the misconfiguration or the misuse, if you will, of their services more than inherent vulnerabilities in the cloud itself. And so this is an example. This graphic is just a quick example of certain types of vulnerabilities that we see every day in configurations that we get from customers. So for example, have the security groups being configured properly. And so what's interesting is these are all what we call policy-driven constructs. So you don't have to go in and conduct an actual penetration scan or a vulnerability scan. We have something called a cloud configuration scanner where we're able to go in and detect these kinds of policy misconfigurations that can help protect you. So you want to make sure, for example, your security groups are configured properly. When you go in and enable IAM roles and access, you want to make sure best practices are followed in terms of key rotation, in terms of limiting the kinds of actions that users can accomplish. You want to have best practices around separation of roles and duties, things of that nature. You also want to be able to make sure that you're following good practices in network segmentation. That means, are you going in and setting your subnets in the right way? Are you going in and sort of creating a nice layered architecture, or what we call micro-segmentation, where your application server is separate from your web server, is separate from your data server, so that somebody cannot go through or breach each one of those in one shot? Are you also going in and, for example, implementing good data protection practices? So, for example, do you have EBS volume encryption turned on? Do you have your S3 buckets encrypted? So again, all of these checks can be made through a simple query and making sure that you have the right security policies applied to your environment. And so that's, again, a key part of really ensuring the security of your environment. So given everything that I shared with you, we from the stackArmor standpoint recommend conducting a vulnerability and penetration scan that consists of 3 key levels of activities. The first one is, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is what we call an architecture review, where we take a look at essentially the way your environment is configured, the way your data is stored, the way access to your web applications and your application servers is provided. And so typically we do this using the information and documentation provided to us by the customer. We are also happy to log in to your AWS account with the appropriate IAM roles and policies under your supervision to go in and make sure that we are able to go in and point out some obvious gotchas that may go in and cause issues later on and are obvious risk indicators for a poorly configured environment. We also go in and conduct a scan along with the review to make sure that we provide you with a detailed report that shows where you have policy misconfigurations on the different aspects of your AWS infrastructure. This covers areas like IAM, RDS, VPC, security group, everything that you can imagine within your AWS infrastructure is covered. These security scans are based on a OWASP and CIS benchmarks. So we take all of that, those requirements and create one single scan, which we are able to then go and present in a single report. So that's the first part. The second part is we go in and conduct an internal vulnerability scan using different kinds of available scanners like AWS Inspector, Nessus Tenable. There are many others, but those are some very common industry tools that we go in and use to go in and conduct essentially a scan of your operating system and the component libraries, including things like your Docker containers that may go in and use, for example, let's say a struts library, which may have inherent vulnerabilities, and we want to make sure that those vulnerabilities are caught and patched. So the bottom line is we go in and execute the internal vulnerability scan of your environment, and then finally, we conduct a black box penetration scan of your web application, both authenticated and unauthenticated. And so typically what we are doing in that scan is essentially taking your endpoint, which is, let's say, your web login URL, and accessing that environment through the scanner. We're looking for, common exploits like, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, things like that nature. So again, we want to go in and very quickly make sure that we are able to detect and lock down those kind of common defects that might exist. One quick note here, and there is a lot of confusion around this in terms of the ask sometimes that auditors have. We found that in 9 out of 10 cases, what I'm describing suffices for the purposes of an audit. But if you're working with an organization that really wants a true blue, if you will, penetration scan, then really that is a slightly different piece of work. And so the best way to describe that is to go in and hunt for the unknowns. So essentially what we're trying to do there is going in and saying, hey, I don't know what's wrong with this application, and I don't know what might lurk inside. And so I need somebody to go in and do an extensive analysis, discovery, and a ethical hacking engagement. And so that generally is very expensive, or at least more expensive than a traditional vulnerability assessment and penetration scan. It takes more longer, and it has some very, very specific objectives. So you want to make sure that you go in and understand from your auditors. And then, like I said, in 9 cases out of 10, when we talk to the auditors or the customers, we're able to generally satisfy their requirements with our approach, which again, we believe is a risk-based approach. So again, you want to make sure that you're educated on what the ask and the requirements are. So in terms of really the engagement model, what does a vulnerability scan and penetration test engagement look like? This slide sort of shows you at a high level some of the key steps. Let me just do a quick time check to make sure that I'm on track. And I also want to take a quick pause and see what some of the questions are so that I can address them in the remaining minutes that we have left on this webinar. Okay, great. I think we are on track. So really, in terms of an engagement model, it consists of an initial kickoff where there is an exchange of information. We go in and make sure all the nuances are understood, all the information access is enabled, all questions are answered. That's followed by a review of the architecture. Again, the architecture review process is fairly nimble and simple. It's based on a voluntary ability and willingness to share information. So if you have information and you're comfortable sharing it with us, we will go in and review it. But again, we don't mandate that you share it with us. We will not go in and dictate what we want. It's really on a voluntary sharing basis. Again, we believe it's in your best interest to go in and get a second opinion on what you have going there so that we can go in and help you with essentially fixing some common best issues that we see in your configurations. That's then followed by what we call an AWS configuration baseline scan. So we are trying to go in and, again, as I briefly mentioned before, go and quickly find out if your VPC is configured right, if your IAM policies are configured, if your security groups are good, if your RDS configurations are right, etc. So we go in and do a quick scan using the stackArmor threat alert engine, which is our proprietary engine, which has approximately 150 plus rules that we go in and check for within your environment, and we're constantly refreshing those. That's followed by a operating system and application vulnerability baseline scan, which is again the piece that I talked about earlier, where we are going in and reviewing the current patch status of your environment. And finally, we conduct an external web application baseline penetration scan. The goal of these baseline scans is to go in and establish your as-is state. So we then go ahead and provide an initial report with findings, and we give you, the customer, the opportunity to go in and take care of those findings. A lot of times, customers ask us for help, and which we're happy to go in and provide. But the goal is to go in and give you all of this information so that you can go in and essentially take care of them and make sure that your environment is reasonably secure. And so once you have completed the remediation process, we go in and conduct what we call a final scan, or as we like to call it, a remediation scan. And so really what we're trying to do there is, we found something, we told you about it, you've gone in and said you've fixed it, so now we come back and say to verify that yes, it's been fixed. Once all of that is done, we finally give you, a letter of attestation that describes the process and that describes what we did and what the high-level findings were and sort of our estimation of the risk profile of the application. This letter is confidential, obviously. We do not provide any information about the specific findings of your system, because we believe that is sensitive corporate information that belongs to you. But really that letter of attestation is a way for you to go in and share with your customers or your auditors that an external third-party vulnerability assessment was conducted and what sort of the nature of the findings were. And we've done this for about 2 or 3 years now, and every time we've got great feedback from our customers about this letter. We've got a number of instances where people were actually were able to successfully go in and sign large deals that were stuck because the customer or the auditor was asking for this kind of a third-party attestation. So now let's take a look at some of the fun stuff. So here is actually a slightly redacted version of a scan that we did a few months ago. And so on the left part of your screen is the results of the baseline scan. And so what you see here is they're marked by severity: critical, high, medium, and low. And so what you can see on your screen is there were 146 critical findings. I mean, clearly this was an environment that needed attention. And so we were able to very quickly go in and do this analysis and present them this report. And so what you see at the right-hand side is the results of what we call the remediation scan, which is the scan that's been done after all of the fixes have been applied. And so obviously a very important part of this is you don't want to ever go in and present a letter of attestation or go through an audit with the findings on the left, right? That would be just unacceptable. Generally, the rule of thumb is that there should be no criticals or highs, and most medium and lows should be remediated. You want to have as few findings as you can. However, there are certain extreme cases where critical and high might have to exist. So for example, in one customer's case, they needed to go in and implement a multi-factor authentication solution. And so that was not easy to do given that it was an IoT use case. So we were able to help them write what's called a justification and create what's called a poem, which is essentially a milestone description to say why that particular finding was not necessarily business critical and what the organization's plan was to go and remediate it, and basically provide essentially a well-written documentation around those findings. So the point here is that it's absolutely possible that you might have certain findings, and it's not at the end of the world if there are. We are generally able to go in and help customers come up with a reasonable way to go in and manage those findings in a way that will be deemed acceptable to an auditor or to one of your customers. Moving along, here is another example of information that we're able to go in and provide as part of the scans. So what you see here is essentially a list of, as I mentioned, we have our own solution called Threat Alert that goes in and looks at the configuration scans in your AWS environment. And so here it's showing up different things around highly critical things that are considered poor practices in terms of, for example, providing users with a high level of admin access. One of the interesting things that you see here is we, during our scans, provide the findings, but then we also provide a comment on why we think it's bad. So, for example, leaving security groups open is a very bad idea. You want to make sure you lock them down to specific ports at least, and protocols. So this is just to sort of give you a flavor of the kinds of data, rich data that's produced as part of the vulnerability scans when we go in and conduct this kind of engagement. So with this, I want to sort of conclude most of my remarks around vulnerability assessments and penetration scans, and really introduce my guest speaker, Alex, who has been very patiently listening through this, and we've had the opportunity to work with Alex and Wagepoint going through an engagement like this. So Alex, thank you so much for joining this broadcast. I wanted to quickly sort of introduce you and sort of invite you to talk a little bit about your experience and going through sort of a SOC audit. And if you could share for our audience what you went through, what kind of decisions you made, and sort of what your experience was, that'll be, I think, a great learning lesson. So just as a starting point, just welcome to the webinar. And would you like to just quickly introduce yourself and your organization?
Sure. Thank you, GP. Wagepoint is a software as a service payroll company. We are completely cloud hosted, and we currently provide payroll services for over 5,000 companies throughout the US and Canada. And in our idea of doing what we do, we have gathered together a pretty cool team of individuals, everybody bringing in a lot of expertise. And when I was brought into the company, it was very specifically to kind of start overseeing the move from a co-location housed application that ran on a single server and move us to the cloud, build up our ability to scale, build up our security protections, add resources as the need arose, and we started increasing our customer base. And then when we started just in Canada and when we moved to the US side of it, it was to bring some more expertise and introduction of the US rules and regulations that are somewhat, but not completely different than the Canadian rules and regulations about how we have to secure our data and how we have to secure things. And one of our biggest trials that we had was that for some of the Canadian rules we had to follow the need to have data stored in Canada, but AWS at that time did not have Canadian hosting. And so as we started moving, eventually they offered up Canadian hosting and we migrated our database to there. But when we did that, we started pairing up with a number of the larger accounting firms to provide payroll services in the back end for these accounting firms so that they could then market those payroll services off to their clients and become kind of a full service accounting firm, providing not just the basic accounting, but also full remittances for all of the taxes to the appropriate agencies, the calculation of payrolls, the printing of pay stubs, all of those kind of things. And in making these agreements with these various accounting firms, as most of you know, accounting firms want a lot of proof and want a lot of documentation around how you're doing things, why you're doing things, and that there is a level of protection involved, not only for us as the payroll company, but for them as a user of the services. So that led to us having to go down the SOC reporting line. And in the process, when we hired a firm to help us get through the SOC process, while we had a lot of documentation in place to specify how we did things in line, part of the big testing of the SOC was validating that all of that documentation was actually being followed, and these things that we were doing were being followed. And everybody kept saying, we need a pen test, we need a pen test. And as GP specified earlier, I think we started off by asking the wrong questions when we first started engaging with GP as to what we thought the pen test and what the people were asking for actually was. And stackArmor was able to provide a lot more clarification of what we were getting into with regards to the pen test, because I have a feeling we probably would have gotten kicked off of Amazon pretty quickly if we had decided to do all of this on our own, not knowing all of the ins and outs of the Amazon structure. The biggest thing that we went through was kind of stepping back and allowing all of their expertise to come in and following their instructions, which were, I really appreciate. Terry Grogan was one of the engineers we were working with, and he would send me these emails with fully detailed instructions on how to configure our AWS environment appropriately, so that not only do we get the pen test completed and everything done the way it needs to be done, but also to do it in a way that is protecting us during the pen test, so that we're not opening up anything unnecessary or making ourselves vulnerable just to have the testing completed. Which was a huge relief to have someone giving us that kind of advice and being able to follow it and seeing the immediate responses and the way their company was able to connect in with us. And it provided us a great overview of getting through the process and understanding what we were looking at and the best ways to do it. And so we found errors, we found issues that we had to address, because our hubris, we thought everything was locked down and perfect, and did not realize there were features that we had by default enabled within AWS that we weren't using, but were defaultly enabled and needed to be disabled or scaled back, or even moved to different sections so that they weren't necessarily causing problems, or at least the potential for security issues. And throughout the whole process, it was really a lot of strong support from the stackArmor team on what we needed to do, how to do it, and then our engineers were able to go in and make all of those necessary adjustments and changes and get everything compliant. And so it was a real, I mean, as pleasant as an audit can be, the part that we dealt with stackArmor was probably the most pleasant part of it. The rest of the audit was, as most of you realize, I think the dentist chair is a little more inviting.
Thank you so much for those comments, Alex. So what's interesting in your journey is a couple of things. Clearly, for you as a payroll solutions provider, your customers, large accounting firms, are obviously were asking for this pen test and this sort of demonstration of, I guess, operational maturity and security maturity. And so, do you think, as you've sort of gone through sort of this first part of your journey, do you think that now that you've gone through this process, that you're more confident, you have sort of a more forward-looking posture that you're able to bring to your customers or new prospects that is now helping you? I guess the question is, by going through this process, do you feel there is an upside that goes in and helps you close more business, new business, more efficiently and satisfy security concerns? Because I know they're popping up every day.
Yes, very much so, because what we have found, it's not just the accounting firms that we're making these contracts and agreements with, it's the small businesses that are coming to us that they read something in the news about some failure somewhere, some breach, and millions of records being exposed and stuff, and they come and ask us very difficult, straightforward questions of what is your security standpoint. Prior to going through the whole SOC process and having the pen testing, the vulnerability testing, we kept everything very close to the vest on how we did things, because we don't really want to give away any of our secret sauce. We don't want to let anybody know how we're doing things, to that kind of security through obscurity mindset. And moving through this process, we now have a much better way of communicating with our clients and potential clients exactly what type of security we have implemented, how we're testing it, how often we're testing it, and so forth. And the funny thing is, 2 days ago, we had a client who asked, and one of our customer support people came back to my office and said, how do I respond to this? And I was like, oh, that's no problem. We have a preset answer. We have the ability to give the reference letters out and show that we've gone through this process. This is where we are. Our testing is done on a monthly basis. Our vulnerability scans are done on a quarterly basis as we move through this process. And so it gave us a lot more confidence to be able to have a predefined statement that we know will help assure people and raise their confidence in what we can do, but also maintain our confidence level that what we're doing is the right steps and the most proactive way we can do it.
That's awesome, Alex. I mean, I think there is a lot of goodness in your experience, and it's sort of really typical what we see with other customers. So I know we are running short on time, and Alex, I know you're a man on the move, and you're a very busy guy. So we appreciate your time and participation. So one quick last question for you. Clearly, you're a much wiser man from the perspective of having gone through the audit successfully, gone through sort of this notion of penetration testing, vulnerability assessment, and obviously the nuances of providing real business value through an enhanced security and compliance posture. So if you were now in sort of the advisor's seat and you had maybe 2 or 3 quick sort of highlights of recommendations that you might have for other folks following in your footsteps, would you mind sharing that with our audience and seeing if they could learn from and benefit from your experience?
Sure. The first thing I would always recommend, especially if you're a small to medium business who's just becoming cloud-based, is there is more capability in the cloud than you probably know or understand. I thought I had a good general knowledge about all of these different things and realized that the AWS cloud system had so many features that caught me off guard as to what they were. One of my first pieces of advice is always to start asking those questions. Find an integrator who you can work with to help guide you through that process and help build your knowledge so that you can get better at what you're doing, but you don't have to spend inordinate amount of time reading really dry AWS documentation and trying to figure out how it applies to you, or does it apply to you, or how can you modify your environment and so forth. The next thing would be to truly test everything. Test your backups, test your scheduled tasks, test all of your different things that you're implementing, especially if you're going down towards a SOC process, and document everything that you're doing. One of the things that we learned through our process is that we had to expand our documentation so that it wasn't just the fact that we were doing it and it was working. We had to have better documentation that we were proving that we were doing doing it and it was working. And so it's a matter of just making that documentation while you're going through your processes, especially when you're doing backups and restore and validating that your data is still accurate. And you're testing, access to your through your security groups and so forth, and making sure everything is okay. Document these things. So it's a big thing. It seems a little silly that you're documenting, but do it, save all that documentation, because if you do get into an audit phase, it's going to be something that saves you an inordinate amount of time and will most likely make the auditors very supportive of what you're doing and how you're doing it. And finally, hire someone to come in and give you that independent testing of what you're doing to validate that you truly are doing it. We thought when we first started 5 or 6 years ago that we could do all of our own testing and it would be fine. There's no point in hiring an outside firm, and only to discover that there were things we were missing, because that's not where our expertise lied. We were experts at payroll and payroll processing. We were not experts in network security and everything else. So take a step of humility and hire the experts and bring them in so that they can and help you increase your knowledge so that you can become more comfortable doing it in the future, but so that you can get to that point a lot quicker and a lot less painful.
Wow, Alex, I think a lot of people should pay you a lot of money in terms of really the kind of advice that you gave them. I mean, just recapping what you shared with this audience. Number one, Amazon and cloud is new. Make sure that you invest in somebody who knows perhaps a little bit more than you right now. Make sure that you're able to go in and make the right decision, go in and sort of short circuit a little bit of that learning curve, to go in and make sure that you're able to, again, use the right services that you need. I think the second thing that you said, I think it's incredibly important, is to invest a little time in the documentation and make sure that you are going in and putting together some meaningful content around what you're doing, your decisions, and your current posture. And then finally, I think, which is really important, is do get an independent third-party test to go in and review what you've done so that you're able to go in and justify what you've done and then, quite honestly, fix them again. Alex, I can't thank you enough for being with us on this show and giving your expert opinion and really the benefit of hindsight and experience. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Alex. You're welcome to hang on or drop off. I know you're busy.
Well, if anybody has any additional questions they want to specifically ask, I'll hang out for at least another few more minutes.
Sounds great, Alex. I appreciate that. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for patiently listening to this broadcast. I hope you found this content useful and meaningful. I know we have a number of questions in our chat window, which we will try and quickly address as part of this Q&A session. The first question we have is, will these slides and will this content be available after the broadcast? The answer is yes. If you want a copy of the slides, please send us an email at the email on your broadcast window, solutions@stackarmor.com, or fill out the contact us form on our website, and we'll be happy to provide you with a courtesy copy. A recording of this broadcast will also be made available in a couple of days on our YouTube channel, so you're welcome to review the content online. The second question we have is actually directed to you, Alex, and it's interesting. The question is, what's been your sort of learning curve and strategy around meeting the needs of customers both in the US and Canada? So I think this relates to your question around, data sovereignty, I guess. So do you want to offer any thoughts?
Sure. Well, one of the biggest things that we started looking at when it came to the privacy policies, data retention, security requirements and data requirements that between the two countries, especially surrounding payroll, taxes, things along those lines, is we looked at the two and compared them as much as possible against each other. And the one that had the higher criteria was the one that we started making sure that we met that as our minimum. Right now, the Canadian rules and regulations actually have a higher criteria for data retention, for the privacy policies, for terms of service and how we establish those things. And so we made sure that we followed those rules and applied those rules both to the US and Canada, so that as we continued our development out from a business standpoint, those were the minimums that we made sure that we were achieving. From a technical standpoint, again, when we started, there wasn't AWS hosting in Canada. Now that there is, we have been going through a process of migrating our databases to the Canadian hosting and migrating our web servers to the Canadian hosting. And we're going through this process on a step-by-step basis. We're not just overnight picking everything up and dropping it in a different region in the AWS cloud, but we're moving things piece at a time and running all of our testing and validation on it, and then moving another piece. And as we go through this process, what we're trying to do is utilize, again, what's the most strict policies that we have to follow, and using that as our baseline. Instead of trying to follow two separate sets of policies, we're just following the most strict set and applying it across the board.
Got it. Alex, thank you so much for that overview. I know the questions are pouring in, but we do want to be respectful of the time from a webinar standpoint. So one question, so I'll try and get through them certainly a little quickly. The next question we have is, how do you conduct penetration testing for a healthcare organization? Great question. Really, from a penetration testing or vulnerability scanning standpoint, there is really not much of a difference. The process remains the same. The only nuance that comes in is we need to be able to go in and make sure that we are able to go in and, for example, look at a BAA. We also want to be able to look at what is the nature of PHI or patient health information that might be involved. So again, there is a little bit of an extra step in categorizing the nature of the risk associated with the system, and then conducting the vulnerability and penetration scanning solution specific to the risk profile of the system as it's required by the HIPAA regulations. So again, as I mentioned, a lot of those are based off of the NIST guidance. So really the process doesn't change, only some of the implementation aspects change. Let me look at some of these questions. Alex, you're a popular guy. I have another one for you. And this will probably be our last one, given the time constraints we have. The question here, Alex, is sort of interesting, given a lot of organizations are startups creating wonderful new innovative solutions on the cloud. And so the question specifically is, what made you change your mind related to use of outsourced providers like stackArmor as an instance, rather than doing it in-house? For example, specifically, was your experience with stackArmor that helped you change your mind? So it's really around, I guess the question is, when did you start looking at outsourcing as a way to complement what you're doing and sort of mature what you're doing?
The off-the-cuff answer is when I decided I actually needed to sleep on a daily basis. As we are still classified as a startup, and when we started, we had an engineering team of 3. There was myself, the original architect of the entire system, and our who is now our head of development, and the 3 of us did everything. And as we have added developers and as we have expanded our staff and so forth, we realized that we don't necessarily hold the expertise necessary to do everything within Amazon. So I would spend evenings and weekends going through the Amazon online seminars that they did, reading all the documentation and moving in and trying to work through and implement particular pieces and functions within Amazon. And there just came a point where I could spend full time doing that, or I could spend full time doing my primary job. And so that was the point when we decided we had a choice whether we were going to hire a full-time kind of DevOps engineer to work on this stuff, or we were going to outsource. And the outsourcing became a simpler solution for us because it gave us a greater variety of what we could have done, because the hiring of an engineer, we were focusing on 1 or 2 areas, but outsourcing allowed us to focus on 10 or 11 areas, because we didn't have to only get that small piece of expertise, but we were getting an entire organization's worth of expertise. Since then, we've embraced the outsourcing idea for DevOps and security functions, so that we can bring a greater level of expertise into our services and make sure that we're really meeting or exceeding those requirements that are part of the audit phases, but also part of what our clientele is expecting.
Great, Alex. Can't thank you enough for that. I do hope you get some sleep. I think it's true for all of the fine folks that are building great systems, delivering great solutions for their customers. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this broadcast. Again, we thank you for your participation. We will definitely try and make sure we answer any remaining questions via email. And please don't hesitate to tune in for our next session, which is on September the 5th, in a couple of weeks from now. And we have a really exciting session on how to use Splunk, which is an industry-leading security incident and event management solution to protect your AWS environment. How do you go in and set up the right kind of dashboards, alerting, monitoring, and some advanced features. So lots of good stuff to come. So again, thank you. Have a wonderful day. And Alex, thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast.
No problem. I enjoyed being here.
Thank you and bye-bye.